Obrigado. I mean, sorry, that's the extent of my Portuguese. Now it's headset time. Well, I'm really honored to be here. I'm not sure whether I should say welcome or because technically we're also the host of this event. I'm part of the research program on sustainability policy and management, as Camila has just introduced. We're co-hosting this event with Enel, with the support of our partners here at the global centers. So thank you everyone for being here. But it's really an honor for me to be in Brazil for the very first time. I actually had a tour of Sao Paulo a couple of days ago and yesterday of Rio. So I had a really lovely time. So it was really wonderful to be here for myself. I'm going to talk about how we can evaluate urban sustainability. First I'll start emphasizing, why sustainability in cities is such a key area in the transition towards overall sustainability. You probably heard the management adage that you cannot manage if you don't measure. So measurement is pretty important. We talked this morning a little bit about quantification of climate impacts, but also about other sustainability efforts or sustainability damages at the city level, how that can be quantified or measured and tracked at the city level, and also at organizational level. If you cannot have those data and those metrics available to track progress, evaluate progress, and compare across cities or across organizations, it's going to be very difficult to hold policymakers or managers of organizations accountable to their words and actions, right? So it's pretty important. Oh, I need a clicker, right? Is this one? No? The green? Oh, here. All right. This is my introduction. I guess Camila did this. Some of the book I published, The Sustainable City, I only had 2 copies with me, which I give to the mayors. We had more copies, I think, with my colleague. So if you're here tomorrow, I'm sure they can share some copies as well. And that book was translated recently into Chinese by myself. And published by the CITIC Press over there in China. As some of you may know, China has a lot of the cities with over 1 million population. So with the fast urbanization rate and industrialization, all of that, it's pretty important that the cities develop in a more sustainable manner. I also co-authored a book on the financial ecosystem, which is about financing for sustainable development. My colleague, Professor Satyajit Bose, who's going to be here tomorrow, he will talk about some of the innovative finance tools that we can use to help us make a successful transition. Obviously, in this move towards sustainability, we need technology, we need policies leading us. We talked about the multi-stakeholder approach this morning. We need participations from grassroots level, from the residents, from the public. But we also need fundings, primarily from the private sector, given the public resources can be quite limited, right? So I think Professor Bose tomorrow will talk about that a little bit. How do we define a sustainable city? This is how we did it in the book. It's a city that uses resources as efficiently as possible, uses renewable resources as much as possible, recycles as much as possible, and has the least possible impact on the natural environment. And together, we basically need a functioning urban sustainable system that includes a transportation sector that really relies on public transportation, accessible transportation, options that are affordable as well to the public. We need public health, which we've all seen the importance of during COVID. We need an equitable food system that's both affordable and accessible as well. Waste management is a big issue here. I think I heard this morning the recycling rate here is only like 4% or something like that. So that obviously need to go up. Waste management is pretty important. Water management, sewage treatment, and all of that as part of the urban sustainable systems need to be built and maintained. Improved probably for a successful transition to urban sustainability. Part of that equation is the finance, right? We need the money, need the funding. Frequently, you will need the help from the private sector in public partnerships and other ways to get us there. We need management in organizations that can incorporate some of the sustainability concepts, some of the approaches into day-to-day management of their organizations. Why cities? First off, this is the urbanization rate. I hear, again, someone said this morning, the urbanization rate in Brazil is going to reach 90% or maybe 80% by 2050. I think in 2017, the world, for the first time, had more people live in cities than in rural areas. So when we're talking about climate change or climate impacts, all of those impacts are going to be magnified in cities because of the size of the population. We can be pure environmentalists, but I'm sure not most people are like that. We care about climate change because they impact our life, and our work, right? So when most people are concentrated in cities, obviously that impact doesn't matter if it's coming from climate change or something that's closer to us, from air pollution, water pollution, ocean pollution, those type of things. Their impact is going to be magnified in cities where the most people live. So I think that's reason number one why urban sustainability is pretty important, just because the increased exposure, right, with more people. We can look at some numbers. City is only 2% of land mass on Earth, but it consumes more than 75% of natural resources, 80% of the world's energy, and 75% of the emissions, CO2 emissions, come from cities, right? Although the climate problems, the climate change, or environmental problems, they are transboundary, right? They're global in nature, but their root, their cause, are local, right, in cities frequently. So that's why we need local solutions. Although climate change is global, but we need local solutions. We need urban solutions to deal with climate change because 75% of the emissions, they actually come from cities. So that's pretty important to understand. Sustainable development, if we're in the US, when we say sustainable development, mostly it's about environmental sustainability, right? We care about economic growth, but that's discussed more separately. But I think in the developing part of the world, including Brazil, when we talk about sustainability, it's more of the concept of sustainable development, where economic growth is still a very strong or important factor. And the social services. In terms of social inequality, this is discussed quite frequently. The inequality, income inequality, is also the most acute within cities, not across cities, right? We can have rich and poor cities, but if you compare the income levels, it can be 5 times richer or 10 times richer. But within the same city, you can have billionaires, and then people live on the streets without any means, right? So the income inequality or the inequality in access to social services, they're the most acute within cities, not across cities. Right? So the social problem is actually quite a difficult problem in the urban sustainability space. This is actually a chart with some of the global cities using Gini coefficient as a measure for income inequality. Do we have Rio? No. We have Sao Paulo, one of the top cities in terms of income inequality, right? Within the city. Without some of the more industrialized cities are unequal in access or in the provision of social services, but a lot of the developing cities, including the ones in China as well, they experience a lot of inequalities in access to social services, right? So that's a major issue that we have to deal with. I have some of these pictures. I don't know what happened here. It's just a contrast. Cities are generally more efficient with the use of resources, right? If you can have people, 500 people live in a skyscraper, residential building, obviously you just need one set of pipelines, one set of facilities, to supply all of those people. But now if you're living in houses like this, it takes up more land. It needs more resources to build on per capita basis. It will consume a lot of resources, energies, right, to heat up the house for 3 people, maybe for 5 people, right? Instead of 500 people live in the same tall building. Obviously, from a resource perspective, from a resource efficiency perspective, it's just better. So cities are more energy and resource efficient, especially for developing countries that cannot afford a very resource or energy dependent development path. Some of the high-income countries, like the U.S., once did, right, with huge populations. So I think that's why urbanization may be the only way for a lot of the developing countries to go up the income ladder, right? Purely because of the energy or resource efficiency. I'm not saying this is not good to live in, but given the resources we have, given the amount of people that we have, given the reality that we cannot keep emitting all the CO2 emissions, we may have to contend with what we have. So in that sense, the continued urbanization may be the way to go, right? But if we have that, most cities in the developing world, I think they're still prioritizing the road network, right? Like this picture on the top shows. So there are huge problems because if you just look at this picture here, there's no underpasses, overpasses, right? But you can see the congregation of people on the 2 sides of the road. So it's basically prioritizing the people with cars. But that can be a very small section of the population, right? The majority of the population, they don't own cars, so they don't really use this road network. So when you're building those roads, although you're increasing the amount of transportation network, we have to ask the question, who is it for, right? You look at all these people, they have to climb the overpass, which was built after the fact, right? The road was built first, and it's not an integrated plan. And then afterwards, you realized it's going to be very dangerous for the people. There's some people you can see in the picture. They're crossing, on the inner city roads, which are really dangerous, right? And then after the fact, you realize, oh, this is not sustainable. They start to build some of those overpasses, which gets really crowded, and God knows they may collapse one day, right? And they're not really of high quality. So that's a problem. So if we have established, urbanizations or urban sustainability is the key, then the urban sustainability problems are the key sustainability problems that we have to solve in a successful transition towards sustainability, right? So these are some of the examples of urban sustainability issues. As we build up the city, we need more material. So a lot of the neighboring ecosystems are damaged, especially rapid urbanization phase. There's a lack of regulation, so some of the mountains or hills, they can be bombed freely for resources, for stones and clay, those materials for you to use to build a house and the buildings. Access again to healthcare, to education, that can be really scarce, and that's definitely an issue. I think this is a picture of Rio during the Olympics. So it can get quite crowded, right? So this is the major problems in all of the major cities with a big population. So those are the main problems because, we talked about education this morning. Sometimes it's just difficult to have a more positive picture, right? But I think, to scare people off with the disastrous effects from climate change, sometimes it's not as conducive. So what we need in some instances is more a positive vision. Not too many people, they just prefer cars with internal combustion engines. That's what we have. It's not like we like it. Or there's some car enthusiasts who like the sounds of the engine starting, right? The F1 racing cars and those type of things. But that's not the majority of the population. Most people, they just like something that they can use to go from place to place, right? If there's a beautiful electric vehicle that doesn't have internal combustion engine, that's also affordable, stylish, and beautiful, people will take it. So that's a more positive vision. It's not like we're scared of emitting more CO2s. It's this positive lifestyle change. I think people, you cannot say, oh, if you're driving a internal combustion engine vehicle, you're going to be fined. You're going to be taxed 20%. We can do that. There's certain economic incentive that will dampen demand for those old model vehicles. But I think a better way just to encourage people to adopt a lifestyle that's equally enticing, right? I think that's why Tesla to some level were successful, because they were able to build these cars that are also stylish. Before Tesla, I think when people think about EVs, they're ugly, they're not really comparable to the internal combustion engine vehicles. But now we have Tesla, which is futuristic. If you can convince people it's also safe, maybe they're slashing prices now, and they're trying to build a more affordable version to compete with a lot of the Chinese brands. So if they do that, keep slashing the price, why not, right? So that's a more positive lifestyle change. So we don't have to keep convincing people that the climate risk is going to be disastrous, going to be huge. So to force people to change, I think it's more productive to have this positive vision, which we have in a lot of situations. This is SDGs. We talk about multi-stakeholder approach, the participatory approach in dealing with sustainability issues. The SDGs, I think, were developed with a more participatory approach. All of the member states participated in the planning stage, in the designing of the framework. The organizations we invited to give their feedback as well. So it's quite an inclusive process. And this is goal number 11 on the sustainable cities. It says that we aim to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Underneath, it has 10 targets. And below those 10 targets, there's also indicators. Overall, there are 17 goals, I think 160 targets, and below those targets, there are 230 indicators. When you come to the level of indicators, they're like the quantitative measures, the metrics that you can have numbers associated with. At the target level, at the goal level, it's more qualitative. It's a description. It's a concepts, right? But in order to measure, we need indicators, which are more quantitative. But before we go into indicators, we have to ask a question, why do we need to measure sustainability? Again, we cannot manage if we don't measure, but then for sustainability, it's just so difficult to measure. We have the established economic indicators to measure economic growth, but what about all those social issues? How do you separate the populations and making sure we're targeting the right population? What are the indicators that are necessary to measure the access to the disadvantaged groups or the poorer regions of a city? And do you have information in those places? That can get really complicated. And when sustainability is such an interdisciplinary concept, when you start to associate a number with this type of concept, it can become really abstract. What does it mean to say sustainability is equal to 42? Right? So it's not like, oh, I'm running a 100-meter race, I run in 12 seconds. That number, 12 seconds, means something, which is easily transmittable to other people. But then to say sustainability is 42 or 56, it doesn't ring a bell, right? We don't really understand what that number means, because the concept of sustainability is so complex. It involves so many different dimensions. There are some attempts trying to quantify this sustainability concept. One that did that at the national level is what we call the green GDP, right? We had the GDP, which measures the flow of the productive activities in economy. And there were attempts, both in China and India, to adopt this green GDP measure. So basically, you calculate GDP in the traditional sense, and you also try to calculate the amount of environmental damages or pollutions associated with the economic activities, in any given year, right? I think China did a pilot, some year ago with 11 provinces, and what he found out is if you start to calculate the negative environmental impacts, sort of monetize them a little bit in dollar terms, it negates in the entirety of your GDP growth, right? So for those 11 provinces that were in that pilot, the GDP growth rate effectively became zero. That was a time when China was growing at 13% a year, right? So it negates all of the growth rate. So that's a huge problem, especially for the politicians. I think the premier at the time were saying, oh, we're going to use green GDP from this point onwards. We no longer talk about the GDP. It has to be green. But the second year, no one hears it again, right? So because politically it's just so unpopular, for all those 11 provinces that were in the pilot, obviously they weren't happy, to say that, oh, our GDP is zero, right? After accounting for the environmental damages. So there's a lot of political blowback. So I'm not sure, any significant economies are adopting a green GDP approach anymore. But that's a good attempt. I think, India is also talking about doing some of that earlier. Why data matters? So this is, obviously, I think I wasn't here earlier this morning, but I'm sure Walter showed you some of those emission charts and stuff. This is how the the emission concentration data are captured. The green dots are the surface stations. This is to measure the greenhouse gas concentrations across the globe, right? And then it's measured at different altitudes and also latitudes, right? And then the blue boxes, they have the observatories, and the green triangle, they're the towers. So we measured at higher altitudes, and then we measured at aircraft level, so much higher in the air. So this is about the concentration of CO2s. But just looking at this map here, and the empty dots, the open symbol, they represent inactive sites. So they're no longer in use, right? So if you're looking at the ones that are still in use, there's a lot of places that are taking measurements in the US, right, or in North America. Other places are more dispersed. Brazil, I think there's one spot. And then, in Africa, there's maybe 4 or 5 places that CO2 concentrations are measured. So just looking at this map here, you can see it's not really representative. But this is where we're getting our data, right? I think we briefly talked about uncertainty as well. A lot of the climate measures, there's a lot of uncertainty. Why there are still people who don't really buy into the climate narrative. I think, primarily for 2 reasons. Not just 2 reasons, but, to me, I think there are 2 reasons we don't really talk about. One is the data, there's still a lot of uncertainty. This is where we get our data, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. At the city level, for example, which I'll show you later, the carbon emissions or the carbon footprint of cities, they're estimated. Your estimate is as good as mine. If you look at estimates from different research institutes, they're vastly different, right? So then how do you convey that information to the public? You tell people, oh, this is really high concentration levels, but then another research institute can come up with vastly different numbers, right? So which is more reliable then? Also, when you calculate the economic damages, like climate change, we think, oh, it's bad. But the impact is not uniform, right? It depends on the regions and depends on industrial sectors. If you're in the tropical regions, closer to the equator, obviously, higher temperature will not help with your agriculture, with people needing more money to spend on energy, to, get air conditioning in the summer times. So there can be detrimental economic impacts. Especially if you look at the map, the countries that are closer to the equator, they're lower income countries, right? So supposedly the developing countries have lower resources and lower abilities to adapt to climate change. For example, with more irrigation technologies, right? So that's why when you read the climate impacts across countries, the impact are pretty substantial for developing countries. But now if you're in North America, if you're in Canada, a few degree rise in temperature can even help. If you look at the country level impact for 2 degree or 3 degree increase in temperature, the overall economic impact is positive for a lot of countries. Right? That may come as a surprise, but the impact is quite, non-linear, right? It's not uniform across countries. It's not uniform across sectors. So that's why we talk to people, I think there's still a lot of confusion. The business is not buying into it. For a lot of places, the climate impact, in 100-year time, if we, keep going down this road, may have a 3%, 4% impact on GDP. That may be our growth rate right now. So like 3 or 4% decrease in GDP or deduction in GDP, it's not that disastrous, is it? Probably not compared to some of the news that we read online, which is saying climate change impact so disastrous. But if you look at the economic damages, frequently they're quite unequal across countries, right? And for a lot of the places, it's not as disastrous as you may imagine. For a lot of sectors as well. If it's getting warmer, in some of the colder places, you don't need to spend as much on clothing, for example. It can be a positive impact, right? So just keep that in mind when you think about this. Again, I'm not trying to deny the climate impact, right? I'm just giving out the facts, and so there's a lot of uncertainties associated with all of this. And then the variations at a more granular level is huge, right? So it impacts different people differently. Obviously, for the people without resources, the countries without resources, the impact is always greater, right? So in this part of the world, obviously, we should care more about climate change than people from other places, right? Obviously, with climate change, it's about CO2 concentrations, right? It's not how much we emit, it's the concentrations. So nothing we can do today will change the climate effects around 2050, for example. But what we do today will impact the things that will happen after that, right, for the next generations. But what will happen around 2050, nothing we can do today will change it, right? It's about the concentration that's already in the air. Unless we can capture the emissions that's already in the air, which we don't have the technology for at the mass scale. The reason I talked about that a little bit is, the data can be misrepresentative, right? Who emits the most CO2? Obviously China at a cross-sectional level on a yearly basis is the largest emitter in the world. But that's not the question, right? Since we care about CO2 concentrations for the climate impact. And for the concentrations, it's accumulative emissions, right? Then you look at the second picture. You see the US and the EU are the big emitters, since the Industrial Revolution, since they started earlier. So that should matter. And then, when I show these pictures in China, people always come back to me and say, oh, this is not fair, right? This is not the right picture to show. And then keep going. And then they'll ask you to show the per capita emissions, right? So the per capita emissions, you can see which countries, the darker the color, the higher the per capita level of emissions, right? So you can see it's, again, the European countries, also in Russia and in North America, those are the places that people tend to emit the most on per capita basis. Because they have the means to buy more, right? Or they have to their resource. They extract a lot of resources, energy-producing countries, where you need a lot of energy. Also, you emit a lot of carbon dioxide. And that's not all. And then we have to look at CO2 emissions embedded in trade. Are we talking about production emissions or consumption emissions? I still remember giving a presentation in China for the fashion industry. I was saying, the fashion industry or textile industry is the second most polluting after the oil industry. And then there's an official from the Textile Industrial Association that came up to me and said, we were producing all these textiles and all this clothing, but not for ourselves. We're exporting them to other countries, to the US, for example. So it should be the consumers who bear the burden of the increased emissions, right? We're not using them. We're producing them, so the emissions counted on our part, but it's actually consumed by someone else. So last picture is trade embedded. So it considers the end users, right? So it's consumption-based instead of production-based. So in that sense, again, it's a high-income countries that consume a lot more because they have higher income and the emissions associated with the higher level of consumptions also higher, right? So you can see it's the same set of data, but they can be presented in different ways to paint entirely different pictures, right? So again, I want the takeaway here is next time you read any climate information or sustainability information, just be more critical with that information, right? And ask questions. Otherwise, it can be really confusing or misleading if you are decision makers or even just for your own understanding, right? There's a lot of things out there. Nowadays the world is depicted in numbers, but the numbers can really be presented in different ways that can have huge, implications, right? City level carbon footprint. I talked about this a little bit. Do we have a city here? No. Then let's just look at New York. You can see the footprint per capita is 17.1 plus or minus 5.5. The plus or minus 5.5 is what we call the standard deviation, right? So one standard deviation, within one standard deviation, plus or minus, gives us a 67% confidence interval, right? So to put that into plain language, what he's saying is the per capita CO2 of New York is between 11.6 and 22.6. And we're 60% confident that the per capita emission is in that range. It's a huge range. It's from 11 to 22. And we're only 67% confident it's in that range, right? What if we multiply the standard deviation by 2? So that's 11. Then 17 minus 11 is 6. Plus 11 is 28, then we're 95% confident the per capita CO2 level in New York is between 6 and 28. That's a super large range, right? Which, it's almost like, it's not really meaningful. It's almost like saying, oh, I'm, fairly confident the per capita emission levels in the city is between 0 and 30. Well, I can't say that, without really looking at the data. But this is reality we're faced with. This is estimated, by one organization, the City Carbon Footprints.info. They have a rigorous methodology. I did check it. But then, if you look at another organization's estimates, you can have vastly different numbers. So there's again a lot of uncertainties associated with climate data, with sustainability data. A little bit more on that. These are the SDGs. Again, we have, for the 17 goals, we have 169 targets, and we have 230 indicators, which are quantitative. And those indicators are further divided into Tier 1 and Tier 2 indicators. So Tier 1 indicators are 130, Tier 2 are 97. The difference between Tier 1 and Tier 2 is Tier 1 indicators are frequently produced by 50% of the country, right? So 50% of the 200 countries in the UN, they produce some data on the SDGs. The Tier 2 indicators, the 97 Tier 2 indicators, there's just no data. Just forget them. They're good concepts, in principle agree with them, but there's no data. If you talk to the finance folks, I'm sure Professor Bose will discuss that tomorrow in more detail. If you talk to the finance people, they all agree with climate change and sustainability is quite important. Morally, we're in sync with those concepts, but you have to give us the models, in order for us to allocate our assets. Otherwise, we agree in principle, but nothing we can do in practice, unless you have the model, unless you have the data. It has to be evidence-based. Otherwise, we cannot really practice it, right? So there's a huge data issue. This is from the 2023, the UN produces a progress report for the SDGs every year. So this is their 2023 report. Let's look at goal number 11, which is the one about cities. The green indicators, the green part of the chart, so that's 10%. The green is like 10%, right? So 10% of the city indicators, the countries are on target, or target met, right? Yellow is making fair progress, but acceleration needed. Red is stagnation or regression, and the gray area is there no data, insufficient data. So here you can see for the for the targets under goal number 11. Public transport systems, no data. Sustainable urbanization, no data. Cultural and natural heritage, there's no data. Urban green and public space, no data. Urban planning, no data. Sustainable and resilient buildings, there's no data. Right? This is at the national level. And about timeliness, supposedly climate change is quite important, and that's goal number 13. So you can see the most recent year data available by goal for number 13, that's from 2015. So this is the progress report in 2021. So let's say we have a progress report for 2023, then the climate data we have that we need to be relied upon is from 6 years ago. And that's not for all of the countries. And that's not all of the indicators, right? It's only a small percentage of the countries, 1 in 6. I think on the next slide. Not on the next slide. But I know this, 1 in 6 countries will have some climate data from 6 years ago. So that's the reality at the country level. When they produce this progress report to the Undersecretary of the UN who's in charge of the SDGs, they say the best data we have is with a 2-year lag. She was shocked to learn about it. But that's just the reality we're faced with. We all know we need data. We need hard facts in order to make decisions, but this is the reality. There's no data, there's no information, right? We all agree with the ideology, but what does it really mean at the organizational level, right? This is at the country level. At the more granular level, there's just no information. So that's a huge issue. For 5 of the 17 goals, fewer than half of the 193 countries or areas have international comparable data. There's just no data, and there's either there's no data or the data is from a long time ago. And also, when you look at the 17 goals, the UN says they're equally important. We have to achieve all of them. There's no substitutability across the goals, which is great. But then if you ask the people, their priorities can be quite different. Right? Out of the 17 goals, the UN actually did a survey, which included 7 million people across the world, from 194 countries. They asked the respondents to choose 6 out of the 16 possible issues that will make the most difference to their lives. Right? It's predominantly developing country respondents. 70% came from the developing countries. Gender-wise, it's sort of in balance. 77% under the age of 30, so it's sort of like a young cohort as well. But this was done in 2015, I think, so they're in their 40s already. Have a guess, what's the most important, what's the least important out of the 17 goals? Any guess? What's the most important? 17? What's 17? Peace? 17, I think, is peace and partnership. I don't know. What's the most important? What's 7? What's that? Energy for all. Okay, that's not too bad. A good education, better healthcare. Those are the most important issues. But what's most surprising? Climate change. Dead last. Right? We talk about this, we need education, we need to educate people, this is the gap in education, right? I mean, maybe there's still some problems with science, but then, maybe it's a bigger problem with education because clearly, especially for people from developing countries, they don't think, climate change is a big issue for their lives. It's quite distant, right? I still remember in China, 1 year, they were talking about, this is irony, at least to me. Before the Paris Agreement, I think maybe around 2010, the official argument for China is, the US is trying to use climate change as a hoax to contain China's development. That's exactly the line that Trump used when he was president. China is trying to use climate change as a hoax to contain America becoming great again. It's exactly the same line. Right? So I think that was quite ironic. So the problem with this is no one in China were really buying into the climate change idea because it's so, far-fetched. It's very abstract. It's not close to our lives. So one day it changed because of air pollution. Nothing to do with climate change. It's because of air pollution. The air pollution became so severe. When you look at the list of cities with the most severe, with the poorest air, 8 of the top 10 cities would come from China. Right? So that's when people fear that this environmental problem going to really affect their lives, their living and their working conditions. That's when the country started to act. Now they're quite proactive. But climate change activities out of China, they're leading in a lot of areas, producing EVs, solar panels, switching to the EVs on the roads, and things like that. They're quite aggressive now. But the thing that made them to change is really because of the air pollution. So climate change impacts out of the Chinese efforts are co-benefits from their local imperatives, from dealing with their local imperatives. Right? So I think that's really key, for Brazil, for some other developing countries, to convince people of climate change may be futile, or maybe, not fast enough, right? But if there's more local environmental sustainability issues that we can tag into, that we can deal with, they will have significant climate impacts, right? So in way of dealing with traffic congestions, you have more public transportation. But as you take more public transportation, it will inevitably help with climate change efforts, right? But now if you're trying to convince people to be more conscious of the climate and then try to switch to EVs or do more public transportation, they may not do it. So it has to be a positive picture. It has to deal with their problems. So you have to think about the synergies, the co-benefits between the local environmental issues and the global climate issues. I think that's really important to think about at the city level and with our education efforts. Is this a timer for me? I only have 1 minute. So, this is a case study, for China primarily, but we did a lot of, global city comparisons, which I thought, I can share with you. So this project started in 2017 with a few partners in China, and we developed this system, a measurement system, with a set of indicators, which supposedly captures all the different aspects of sustainable development. Right? I use the word sustainable development here. Again, in the U.S., we talk more about sustainability. It's not like social issues, economic growth are not important. We just talk about them, separately. So then you have economic development. With indicators like GDP growth, service sector added value, unemployment rate, science and technology expenditure, growth rate, and then there's social services section, environmental resources, emissions and consumption, and then management, right? So we think those 5 areas are integral parts of urban sustainability or urban level sustainable development. And then we developed ranking. Based, can I back? The red? Okay. Then we developed ranking based on these 24 indicators. And this is how the city ranked. The greener, the higher the ranking. Initially, we ranked 100 cities, medium level and above. And then I think we expanded, we were ranking like 110 cities. We want them to be representative of each of the areas. So what we did is, we look at the province population. If the province is 5% of the overall population, then we'll take 5 cities from that province, just to be representative, at least on population level. I want to make sure geographically it's represented as well, so we made sure we included cities in western parts of China. The spots are more sparse. That's because there's fewer people, right? In Tibet, for example, there's only 2 million people. And the reason we didn't include more cities is because the data is very difficult to come by. We have to make sure we find data. All of these indicators, remember the SDG example, the information, the indicator is quite difficult to find. They may be available for a lot of the cities along the coast, which are economically more developed, so there's more capacity with data collection. But a lot of other cities, they may not have resources to collect all those information on a timely basis. So that's always an issue. I think I'll skip the technical parts. It's ranking based. I'll skip this. This is too complicated. I do this to my students, but probably not to the audience here. Let me just explain this a little bit. I think the innovative part, which I want to share with you of this system, is really its weighting methodology. So we take 5 years of data, from the previous five years. If the variation is small, then we'll give it a higher weight. So usually when you make this type of rankings, the weighting are decided by experts. Let's say sustainable development is economics, social, and the environment. Why don't we give them equal weighting, and 30% for environment, for economic growth, 30% for social services, 30% for environmental sustainability. So that's a top-down approach. The experts will come together and decide on the weighting. Usually it's equal weighting across indicators, across aspects of sustainability. So we didn't do that. What we did is we took the indicators, previous 5 years data. If there's more variations, we'll give it a lower weight. If there's lower variation, we'll give it higher weight. What that is saying is, for example, on this indicator GDP growth rate, you can see majority of the cities are in a very narrow bound. So majority of the cities, let's say 70 or 80 out of the 100 cities, 100 Chinese cities, they had GDP growth rate between 2.5% and 4.5%. It's a very narrow bound, and most cities are within this bound. Then what happens is, if you improve just by a tiny bit, let's say this year the Rio de Janeiro economy grew by 2.5%. Next year it's 2.6%. But mere 0.1% increase can bump up your ranking by 20 places. Is that deserved? Should sustainability be judged on such small differences? So that's sort of like a sprint race. Unless you're Usain Bolt, who comes number one every single time, the other athletes, their rankings are shuffled from race to race, right? And their record are separated by 0.01 second. So if our goal is to measure the physical potential of human beings or whatever, right? That 0.1 difference, is that really meaningful in a scale for measure human strength or human potential? Probably not, right? So in order to measure sustainability, such small differences is not meaningful. We try to emphasize long-term and sustainable growth, sustainable change, not what we call idiosyncratic differences, right? So it's when cities are separated by very small differences, then we'll discount those indicators. We'll give them lower weights because the ranking is going to be too volatile. You change a little bit, you either go up or go down in rankings dramatically, right? But not due to sustainable change or meaningful policy actions, right? It could just be a change in, there can be an error in data collection or, ad hoc policy that will be here this year but not next year. So that's not meaningful. That's not sustained long-term change, right? So if cities are separated greatly, where you have to make efforts to improve your performance, then we'll give those indicators a higher ranking, right? Just think about swimming or sprints in those places. A small difference doesn't really mean a lot in the grand scheme of things, right? It measures the athletic abilities of humans in general, right? So that small difference is not meaningful. It's meaningful for the athletes, in that competition, but probably not to the outside world, right? So we shouldn't take that approach in our accounting for sustainability. So that's, I think, the major innovation of our measurement system. I'll skip the rest just to save some time. At this point, it's important. Let me just do this quickly. So when we have a lot of indicators, we have to aggregate them. We have to add them up, right? There are two ways of doing that. One is what we call the arithmetic mean. You add indicators, you basically sum them together and divide by the number of indicators. If you do that, you're assuming the indicators are independent. So there's no substitutability among indicators. There's substitutability among indicators, right? If x1 is smaller, x2 is larger, the improvement in x2 can compensate the poor performance in x1 if you're just adding them up, right? So higher score will compensate the lower score equally, right? Or you do what's called a geometric mean. So you multiply all the indicators and then take the nth root. Right? If the indicators you think are related to each other, then you take the second approach, like the geometric mean. The Human Development Index is following this approach because the indicators are related. Obviously, for sustainability, the indicators are related. If you do good on the economic growth, you should do good on social services as well. You should try to be good on environmental sustainability. They're not substitutable. Right? It's not like, oh, we can be great in economic growth, we don't have to care about the environment. That was the old approach. We're trying to advocate an approach where we take things more holistically. We try to improve on all of the aspects, right? So technically, we should take the second approach, the geometric mean, instead of the arithmetic mean. So if we did that, this is the ranking in blue. This is ranking produced by the geometric mean approach. The column in red, in white, are following the arithmetic mean approach. So now if we just look at Beijing, well, that's a city we all know. It's number 6 in the ranking of sustainability if we use the arithmetic mean approach. And suddenly it drops to 29 if we use the geometric mean. Because the geometric mean approach, they emphasize the lower scores. For some of the bigger cities, their environmental or their sustainability issues can be quite severe. So they can have indicators that rank really high. For example, in Rio or in Sao Paulo, if you're going to do a ranking on economic growth, they're going to be up there, right? But there can be other areas, maybe in terms of inequality, in terms of housing affordability, those type of social indicators, the big cities tend to perform really poorly, right? If you think those indicators related, you do a geometric approach, you're going to have Sao Paulo and then Rio ranking really low because the lower performing indicators are going to have a bigger impact. I'll skip this. We compared some of the global cities. We didn't do Rio, we had Sao Paulo on here. GDP growth rate. This is, I think, 2021. It's just out of COVID. New York is number 1 because of the low base, right? Sao Paulo has 6.62. You know, all of the cities had positive growth again because 2021 there's a lot of shutdowns due to COVID. Service sector added value, unemployment rate. Unemployment rate and service sector added value they're related because if you are heavy in service, again, this is due to COVID, there's more shutdowns, right? Unemployment rate tend to be higher and vice versa. Road area, so this was an imperfect measure for congestion. Hong Kong is quite crowded. Cairo had a lot of people. So in terms of per capita road area, those cities ranked really low. House income ratio, this is for housing affordability. Hong Kong widely known as the most, the houses are most unaffordable. Sao Paulo is 0.2, not really great there. New York is more affordable. I think sometimes it depends on the measurements. I think a lot of the neighboring areas were included. If you're just talking about Manhattan or the 5 boroughs, obviously the housing price is quite high. And also because a lot of people rent, they don't own. So I think that has a damping effect on it as well. Teacher-student ratio, education. I had a guide in Sao Paulo, who told me, even we have to really care about education here in Brazil. Per pupil, teacher-pupil ratio is 1 1 teacher and 24 students, right? So that's not really great. You have to spend on education a little bit more, obviously. Population. This is urban green space. I see a lot of green space here. I think the reason is, again, it's in the measurement. Sao Paulo is really low, although I went to some of the beautiful parks and gardens, a lot of trees, but it's measured differently. I think, some cities, when they say green space, includes the grasslands, includes the parks. Other places like Sao Paulo, I think even New York, they're only talking about the areas with tree cover. So it's not really, the parks, the grasslands, those are not included. So that's why you have a low number. So it depends on the measurements. Again, to my earlier points, when you look at these numbers, you have to be more critical in reading the numbers and ask good questions. Air quality, I said China was really poor in air quality. Now they're off the list. Now you look at the top 10 cities in terms of poor air quality, it's all cities from India or Bangladesh. I think China pretty much is off the list because of the efforts they took in the past couple of decades. Water consumption, energy consumption. Again, the developing countries, you have a sector, a big manufacturing sector, you're going to have to consume more water and more energy, right? If you're more intensive in services, then the water and energy consumption is not that high, right? But again, if it's consumption-based, probably going to have different pictures. Sewage treatment, all pretty well. Household waste harmless treatment rate, pretty high. Sao Paulo is the lowest, but it's still like 97%, right? So it's not too bad. Some policies, I'll skip this since we're running out of time. I think that's it. That's all I'm going to say. Questions? Oh, thank you. Thank you.